Hello, welcome to Dialogue from the Woodrow Wilson Center, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. I'm Blair Rubel, your host for today's program. We live in a complex moment in U.S.-Russian relations. On the one hand, there's been a growing distrust of one another in both countries for the past several years. On the other, this is a moment in history when our two countries, in fact, have become much more integrated than at any time in the past half-century, perhaps as those in business can best appreciate. The Obama administration has been shaping its policies by aiming at making progress on the oldest of all the items in the U.S.-Russian agenda, arms control. But even if progress is made on arms control, how much further improvement can take place in the relationship? My guest is Mark Medish, a visiting scholar and senior advisor at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mark served in the Clinton administration as special advisor to the president and senior director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian affairs on the National Security Council. Mark Medish, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you, Blair.
Mark, I'd like to turn the clock back just a bit to the beginning of the relationship after President Obama was inaugurated, and Secretary of State Clinton's first meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov. Secretary Clinton presented Foreign Minister Lavrov with a restart button as a way of saying symbolically, this is a new relationship. But I know you've expressed some skepticism about the notion of reset in the relationship. Why is that?
Well, Blair, the reset button is now a phrase that has taken a life of its own, and it's sort of a metaphor that's running out there. People are commenting on it, and there are real questions about what it really means. It's well known that it was mistranslated in the actual meeting. It was translated into Russian as overload rather than reset or reboot or restart. Might have been a bit of a Freudian slip, a sense that there's a lot of baggage in the relationship and we're overloaded. And the Russians were at first actually skeptical, if not a bit offended that the word had been mistranslated. You know, I think the problem with the metaphor is that it suggests automaticity, an almost mechanical process, where in fact the main challenges are political and psychological and will take hard work and a lot of time and are anything but automatic.
Well, maybe we could explore that a little bit, because I can well imagine that there are observers who will say we want the relationship to be automatic. Why don't you think that that's even possible? What is it about this relationship that makes it difficult?
Well, I think that we are two big, complex countries, and we have to approach each other that way. The idea that the top leaders represent the relationship, summit meetings, for example, that is the sum total of the relationship, I think is actually a misplaced notion. Summits can play an important role, but the real life of a relationship, I think, occurs at many, many different levels, both of the government and, more important, of society at large, whether it's commerce or cultural, tourism, all those levels. And the reality is there's quite a lot of work to be done to take advantage of the potential of the relationship between the United States and Russia. And that comes from both sides.
What level do you think the work has to be done? Where would be, if the summit is nice enough, but where would the payoff come?
Well, I want to be fair here. I think there is a logic to the reset button, which is very important, and it's not surprising that a new administration would want to come in and take a fresh look at challenges and opportunities. And I think that's what Secretary Clinton was trying to get across. And I should add, to give credit where credit is due, I think Vice President Biden was the first one to actually use the phrase at his Munich speech. And that's what the Obama administration is trying to get across, that they're coming in with open minds, and they want to look at the whole relationship and try to re-engage, recommit with the Russians to tackle a variety of concrete problems. But again, it takes two to tango, and that means the Russians, for their part, must recommit to that kind of engagement.
And when you take a look at that agenda, what issues would be on there? We've already mentioned arms control, but what else is on there?
And again, arms control is very important, and one could argue that we, collectively, Americans and Russians, took it for granted after the end of the Cold War, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. We made some progress on arms limitation and arms reduction, but we were mostly implementing agreements that had already been reached. We still have vast nuclear stockpiles, so I don't want to diminish the importance of that issue for enhancing our security and our confidence in one another, and the world's confidence in both the United States and Russia, permanent members of the UN Security Council. We tell the world we're very concerned about nuclear proliferation. Well, we ought to walk our talk. So this is a very important area, but then I think there are other areas, such as non-proliferation of the technology for weapons of mass destruction, for WMD, whether it's fissile materials, biochemical. The Russians and the US are in a strong position to reduce global risks in those areas. That's what the Nunn-Lugar program was about coming out of the 1990s. Congress appropriated quite a bit of funding to help contain these technologies. There are regional security issues. Afghanistan, Iran, of great importance, where we can and should work together. There are economic and energy issues that are worth addressing. This is all in the official context, and as I mentioned before, there's so many other layers of social interaction that I think we ought to be promoting with Russia, as we do with all other countries of the world in this era of globalization.
Mark, as I listen to you talk, I'm struck by, on the one hand, you're setting out a kind of typical agenda, but you keep alluding to the deeper context. And I'm wondering, I know that there was a time when you were teaching law in Russia, that you were traveling around Russia, sleeping on airport floors and so on and so forth. Did that experience make Russia seem a different place for you than perhaps for a lot of people engaged in policymaking?
Well, sleeping on the airport floors. I should disclose I've slept on airport floors in the U.S. as well, okay. So I'm familiar with the floors at Denver and Chicago airports. No, I do have sort of personal perspectives on Russia and where it is in its development and transition. As you may know, I have some family roots. My father grew up in the Soviet Union and emigrated to the U.S. Decades ago, but we have some family roots there. You know, I think of Russia as a country that is both very old and very new. And it has issues of identity, finding its place, its voice, its role in the world. Every country has a challenge like that. Russia has a particular challenge because it's sort of re-emerging in a new form. And sure, we're 20 years after the Gorbachev period, but these are still early innings.
I'm struck as you say that there is a kind of natural impulse in both Moscow and Washington to kind of retreat to the language and imagery of the Cold War, because that's the imagery we're all comfortable with in dealing with one another, and yet you describe a Russia that really is different from what the Soviet Union was. And so what kind of misfit do you see between the conceptual framework we all have when we talk about Russia and what Russia has and has not become?
Well, on your first point, I think you're exactly right. There is a lot of Cold War imagery, rhetoric, and sentiment about on both sides these days, and for some very understandable reasons. I mean, a lot of tension has developed in the relationship between Russia and the West, Russia and Europe, Russia and the United States, Russia and its neighbors. That has reminded people of some very negative scenarios and times of confrontation and long standoffs. The culmination point was last year with the short but very serious, dangerous war between Russia and Georgia. in August 2008. It's that context that has given, I think, a lot of people the sense that maybe we have been in a mini Cold War, a mini reversion to old habits. And I think there are people very aware of the dangers of that path, seeking an alternative approach and looking maybe for a mini détente. And I think that, again, the reset button goes to that idea that let's step back from the brink together. We really don't want to go further in this direction. This is extremely dangerous, non-productive. To your second point, I think it is important that we understand that Russia is very much a work in progress in terms of its identity, in terms of its self-concept, its self-consciousness. You know, it was part of the Soviet Union, it was part of the Russian Empire. It had relationships with its neighbors based on those states. And there is a kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome here, or an imperialist hangover, you might say, at work.
You've mentioned a couple of times neighboring states, Georgia, Ukraine. These states have been something of a point of contention in the relationship, and I'm wondering if you could say a few words about how you view the state of American relations with Ukraine, with Georgia, and how our relationship with those countries fit into the context of U.S.-Russian relations.
Well, yeah, and it's, of course, the former Soviet republics comprise everything from the three Baltic states to Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, the Caucasian states, the Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, and the others. The U.S. has been and will continue to be a strong supporter of the independence and sovereignty of all these countries, we have strong bilateral relationships with as many of them as we can. You mentioned Ukraine and Georgia in particular. They've been the source of a lot of attention, in part because of the conflict, the military conflict with Russia, but also the gas dispute with Ukraine. That's been a recurring theme between Russia and Europe. Again, the U.S. is a long-term supporter of peace and prosperity and integration for these countries as much as they want it. I think it's the challenge for U.S. foreign policy is to have the patience to have a long-term perspective on these things. If we get impatient, if we make the best the enemy of the good, we could run into trouble. So I think we should have no mistake about the direction these countries want further integration with the West, with Europe, with transatlantic institutions, and we need to promote that and support that.
And at what point do we run into opposition from Russia on those? There is a Russian position that this is their backyard.
There is that position, and it's one that we can't endorse. We don't endorse, again, because we support the sovereignty of these countries. So that any notion that people in Russia might have about reabsorbing or the like, those would be highly problematic ideas for Europe and for the United States. Certainly for those countries. But that said, we ought to be smart about our mode of engagement and integration of these countries. I mentioned a moment ago the risk of making the best the enemy of the good. In my view, if one puts certain status objectives ahead of substance, one could fall into a trap. And to give you an example, that's to say that, you know, Ukraine or Georgia should become NATO members by X date, or should become EU members by a date certain. that's really a recipe for disappointment and trouble.
There's another source of potential trouble, which one hears in talking to Ukrainians and Georgians, which basically is that we will reset the relationship with the Russians. We'll do it at their expense. We'll trade some greater American strategic goal, say some sort of agreement on how to deal with Iran, and kind of sell out our values when it comes to countries like Ukraine and Russia. This has historically been a tension inherent in U.S. relations, the tension between values and strategic objectives. How do you think we can best straddle, do you see a contradiction between our strategic objectives and our values in the relationship with Russia? And if so, how can we manage that tension?
I've heard the views that you've just summarized, and I think it's important for us to understand that those concerns are quite rational if you're sitting in Kiev or in the Baltics or in Tbilisi, just as they would be rational sitting in Warsaw, Budapest, and other places where they, the dominant recollection of the latter half of the 20th century was Yalta. Mm-hmm. It's a real concern. I can say from my experience in the U.S. government and with U.S. policymaking that the U.S. is absolutely steadfast in its commitment to support the sovereignty of these countries. And so the reset button is not some veiled message about a new Yalta or Potsdam or the like. But it's again why I say we ought to be smart about our modes of engagement. We ought to be steadfast, but also avoid unnecessary provocations toward Russia. It's not as though Russia has no interests in this region, and we ought to be clever about it.
Now, we've been talking about resetting the relationship from the point of view of the United States, but if we were sitting in Moscow, how do you think Russians believe the relationship should be reset? What's their bill of particulars against us?
I think, a senior American diplomat actually came up with a great phrase last year in the wake of the war in Georgia, where he said to me, Russia is behaving like a driver with road rage, like a driver who feels that he's been cut off one too many times on the highway and is now, letting loose with anger. Mm-hmm. And what he meant by that was Russians' sense that there was really a list of grievances, that the U.S. had not listened to Russian views on various security matters over a period of time. And they would point to the plans for missile defense in Europe. They would point to support for unilateral declaration of independence in Kosovo. They would point to the push for quick NATO enlargement to include Ukraine and Georgia. And the sense was that in the Kremlin, or wherever the decision-making place is in Moscow, they had just gotten fed up. And they wanted to show the world, and show the U.S. in particular, that the shoe was on the other foot. A sort of tit-for-tat mm-hmm. outburst. If the U.S. can recognize Kosovo, Russia can recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and on down the line. So I think that is the psychological context that we've been in for a while now. I think the Russian reaction has been hysterical in many ways, but it's still something we have to take into account in the way we formulate our priorities.
Mark, as I listen to you talk, I know you enjoy and read Russian literature, and I'm struck by the psychological dimension to what you're saying, and I almost have the sense that perhaps some of the great Russian authors would be a better way of getting a handle on what's going on than reading speeches of contemporary political leaders. But of course, there's a range of Russian authors one could look at. One could look at the satire and farce of Gogol, or the psychological portrait of despair of Dostoevsky. If you were to recommend that our viewers think in Russia in terms of Russian literature, where would you point them?
That's a great question. You know, it's probably some mix of the nationalism and darkness of a Dostoevsky, the spiritualism of a Dostoevsky, the naturalism of a Tolstoy, and the dark satire of a Bulgakov. Mm-hmm. And the unexpurgated demons of a Solzhenitsyn. That's still, in my view, part of the overhang of Russian history, not a complete coming to terms with the past.
Do you see any progress at all on that front?
No, in fact, this is probably the area that I'm most concerned about, even after we've mentioned all those important policy areas. The recent announcement by President Medvedev of an intent to form a committee on investigating so-called falsification of history, to my ears, just has very dangerous connotations. It suggests a turning away from an open and frank assessment of the nation's past, and all nations struggle with this. I mean, Americans understand this. We have difficult legacies in our history. This is a country that had slavery. The way we've made progress, moral progress and social progress, is by addressing the problems and the issues and the dark demons, not by avoiding them and not by accusing those who ask the questions of falsifying history.
Now, you've really set out a much more complicated agenda in the relationship than was implied by a reset button. And I'd like, as we begin to wrap up, I'd like to ask how you would evaluate progress, both in the short term, in terms of upcoming summits, arms control agreements, economic relationships, but also in the longer term dimension that we've just been talking about. What would you see as success in the relationship?
First of all, I should say that the discussion about national psychology I view as I'm making observations as a friendly observer from a distance, right. And I think that's a challenge not for the U.S.-Russia relationship, but for Russians themselves, in the same way that it is a challenge for all countries coming to grips with their own pasts. So I don't mean to throw that into the into the mix. But that said, there is an element of psychology that's required for the success of a reset. Both sides have to agree psychologically and in good faith that they want to take a fresh look at things and try to work together to solve concrete problems. And I think in the near term, the challenge for President Obama, President Putin, President Medvedev, Prime Minister Putin, and their colleagues is to define a few very clear objectives and get them done. Start with the arms control agreement, the next phase of START. Very important, but set the goal of getting that done. Let's not aim too high here. Let's not hype the relationship. Let's not talk about a strategic partnership. Or let's be pragmatic and get a few things done, solve a few problems together. Cooperation on Afghanistan, on narcotics trafficking, which is a huge problem for the Afghan people, for our forces there, for Russia and for Europe. A lot of room for cooperation. Iran. But a few tangible results would speak much louder than a series of summits and photo opportunities and talk of strategic partnership.
And where would you look for a breakthrough to come first if we are going to make progress in very tangible terms?
I do think that the work on arms control is a realistic target, and I think there's hard work being done on both sides on that right now to prepare for the July summit in Moscow, where President Obama will be visiting Russia, and it'll take more work through the remainder of the year. I think that Russia's WTO accession is another area.
World Trade Organization.
The World Trade Organization, where Russia has had an application for membership for a long time, and like any other applicant, there are things that Russia has to do that have been negotiated to bring its legislation into compliance with the WTO standards. They need to work on that, and we need to support them in this process. We've talked about it for a long time on both sides. There's been a lack of will and a lack of follow-through. The key point here is that the relationship is not about the prestige of, you know, two superpowers talking. That's not a successful relationship, really. You look at the successful international relationships in the world, and those are based on multifaceted, many-leveled interactions between societies. I think you ask about the long run, that's what we ought to be striving for with Russia, as we are with China and many other countries around the world.
Mark Medish, thank you for being on our program. And that is our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm Blair Rubel, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHZ Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhzworldview.org. Join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching.